Testing. We will start in 1 minute. Just welcome everyone who's joining us on the live stream. And we're just waiting for some people to take their seats in the auditorium here. We'll start momentarily. Thank you. Hello? Okay, good. Hi, good evening. Welcome to Old Growth Forests in Montana. Where are they? Why are they important? And what can we do to save them? We have an exciting evening ahead with Joan Maloof and a special guest. Tonight's event is the 9th in our series, Under One Canopy, Celebrating Trees and Forests, culminating in our annual Earth Day Festival on Saturday, April 20th at the Gallatin County Fairgrounds. If you've missed some of our previous events, or if you want to find out information about upcoming events, please visit our website at www.gallatinvalleyearthday.org. I'm thrilled to see all of you here tonight. I was just curious, how many of you in the audience have actually been in a old growth or very mature forest in your life? Whoa, I would say that was 100%. I'm impressed. My name is Ann Reddy. I'm the chair of the Gallatin Valley Earth Day Committee. I'm really looking forward to Joan's talk about old growth forests tonight. But before we get to that, I just need to take a few minutes to thank our sponsors and underwriters of this event. Our whole series of talks is only possible because of the support from businesses, government agencies, and different nonprofits in our community. So I would like to thank our fiscal sponsor, Greater Gallatin United Way, our premier sponsors, the City of Bozeman, VW of Bozeman, and Audi Bozeman, and our benefactor sponsors, Sacagawea Audubon Society, Gallatin Wildlife Association, our local radio station, KGVM, Bozeman Greenbuild, and Montana Parents Magazine. And also our stewards, Bridger Bowl Ski Area, Happy Trash Can, Republic Services, and Steo Bozeman Mountain Studio, and of course, all of our community volunteers who make this happen. And last but not least, I would like to thank the underwriters for tonight's event. I hope you enjoyed some of the food and exhibits out in the lobby, and thanks to them, you were able to enjoy that. And that includes the Sierra Club, Gallatin Wildlife Association, and Sacagawea Audubon Society. Without their generous support, we would not have been able to bring you tonight's program. So as I mentioned, Sierra Club is helping bring this event to you tonight. So I would like to introduce Nick Jivak from the Sierra Club just to tell you a few things about the great things that Sierra Club is doing. Nick?
Thank you. Again, I am Nick Jivak. I'm a field organizer on wildlands and wildlife for the Sierra Club. And for those of you who don't know, the Sierra Club is our nation's oldest conservation organization. We work every day on clean air and clean water and clean energy and abundant wildlands and wildlife, and for the opportunity for everyone to enjoy that. And I think that's very relevant, of course, to what we're going to talk about tonight, because if you think about everything, all those core natural resources, old growth forests benefit all of that, right? They store carbon, they provide us clean, cold water, and of course they make excellent wildlife habitat for all kinds of species of mammals, birds, amphibians, you name it. And so I think we're really honored to have Joan here tonight. You know, we have an incredible opportunity right now because the Biden administration is working on an old growth conservation rule and amendment to Forest Service plans. And this is a really historic opportunity to conserve some of these areas. And they're working to identify those forests on our national forest system and on other lands and conserve those. So that is one of the many things we are working on in the Sierra Club. So, and I think that, of course, again, benefits all of us, whether you go in those forests or not. And we are so fortunate here in Montana and the Northern Rockies to have these forests. And of course, all of the natural resources that they support, the abundant wildlife, they support grizzly bears, they support elk, they support wolves, wolverine. We could go on and on. And so, you know, when it comes to wildlife and wildlands, there's few places quite as important as old growth forests. And with that, I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, and that is somebody who knows a little. Oh, do you want to handle that? Is that Doug? Okay. Anyway, thanks for coming out.
Sorry about that, Nick. I had still to thank our other two underwriters, so we'll get to our special guest momentarily. But I just wanted to thank the Gallatin Wildlife Association, our second underwriter for tonight's event. They wanted me to say a few things about them just to save time. So we can get on to the exciting part of our program here. But Gallatin Wildlife Association is a local nonprofit and who has been giving a voice to wildlife since 1976. And they are dedicated to the preservation and restoration of wildlife, fisheries, their respective habitats, and migration corridors in Southwest Montana and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. They speak for wildlife through issues such as climate change, the importance of old growth forests, and the overriding right of wildlife to exist on this planet. And they do that based upon litigation and on educating and informing the public. So we ask that you visit their website at gallatinwildlife.org. And our third underwriter for this event is Sacagawea Audubon Society. They are a dynamic local force in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem of Montana. Protecting old growth forest is a cornerstone to their mission, with work toward the creation of the Lee Metcalf Wilderness area over 40 years ago. They invite you to participate in their field trips. They have workshops, their Indralin Audubon Wetland Preserve Busy Beaver volunteer program, and many, many other projects that protect and conserve our natural environment through enjoyment, education, and action. So we are really lucky to have these three great organizations in our community. And we're also very lucky to have our special guest here tonight to say a few words more about old growth forests and introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Joan Maloof. But before I introduce our special guest who's hanging out here, I just wanted to let you know that we will have a question and answer period once Joan's presentation is over. So if you're joining us online, and we have a lot of folks doing that tonight, I want you to look at your screen, and at the bottom, there are the letters Q&A. All you have to do is click on that Q&A, and a box will pop up. You can enter your question for Joan there, and then one of our tech people will read that question to Joan so she can answer it for you. If you're in the audience, we have a mic. Just raise your hand and I will bring the mic to you because we want the people joining us online to be able to hear your question. So that's why we need the mic there. Well, anyway, as I say, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Doug Smith, to the stage. As many, many of you know, Doug Smith retired in 2022 after 28 years of service in the Yellowstone National Park. During his tenure, Doug supervised the wolf, bird, and elk programs, and he began his tenure as a project leader for the Yellowstone Wolf Project, involving the reintroduction and restoration of wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. Doug has studied wolves for 44 years and birds for 14, And so we are super thrilled to have Doug with us tonight. So please join me in a round of applause to welcome Doug up to the stage.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I'm here for setup. And you might wonder after that introduction how I got to be in that position. So I just want to say a couple things. There's a lot of old growth in Yellowstone. It happens to be one of the most flammable forests in the park. Spruce fir forests are old, they're late climax forests. They grow high, they're subject to lightning strikes. They're more flammable than lodgepole pine. And so, in the old days, people used to think all fire was bad. Now folks think all fire is good. So we're going from one extreme to the other. So this is just something to think about. In a couple weeks, there's another speaker here, George Werthner. He's going to talk about fire policy. But I just wanted to point that out as it relates to old growth. But again, and I don't want to take away from Dr. Malouf, but as I prepared to make these comments, I noticed a passage in a book that many of you haven't heard of, Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, not Origin of the Species. I know all of you have read Origin of the Species and know many passages from it. Not that. This is Voyage of the Beagle that I stumbled on preparing for this eminent person's talk. So this is Charles Darwin, Voyage of the Beagle, quote, "Among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind, none exceed the sublimity, the primeval forests undefaced by the hand of man. Whether those of Brazil, where the powers of life are predominant, or those of Tierra del Fuego, where death and decay prevail, both are temples filled with the varied productions of the God of nature. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved and not feel that there is more in man than the mere breath of his body," unquote. So I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Malouf, and her latest book is Nature's Temple. She had to have gotten that title from this passage. But what a wonderful passage. This is the 1830s when Darwin's writing this. So that's the parting thought I want you to have. And now it's my job to introduce our featured speaker. And all of nature needs a voice. That's a pressing issue in the world today. And Joan Malouf has carved out her niche as the voice for these ancient forests. She's probably been in more old growth forests than any human. She founded the Old Growth Network, she tells me, 12 years ago. Part of that is going into every county in the country and finding a place where forests can grow and protecting that area so it can grow till its fullest extent. She has done many pieces of advocacy and speaker all over the country on the behalf of these trees who don't have a voice. She's their voice. She's published 5 books teaching the trees, Among the Ancients, The Living Forest, Treepedia, and Nature's Temple. Now, temples. We know where she got the title from now. She is a professor emeritus at Salisbury University in Maryland, near where she lives, and she used to teach there biology and environmental studies. And after all those long introductions, I know you're anxious to hear Dr. Joan Malouf.
Thank you so much. So About 4 or 5 years ago, I had a telephone call and I picked up the phone, even though I didn't recognize the number. And it was this young man and he was saying, "Can you tell me where the old growth forests are in Montana?" That young man in the audience today? I don't think so. But I said, "Well, that's a good question, but no, I can't tell you where the old growth forests are in Montana. I can tell you where the old growth forests are in a lot of other places because I was making a habit out of collecting materials far and wide that was all separated. Old growth forest in the east by Mary Bird Davis, old growth forest in Oregon and California, but I didn't have anything on the old growth forests in Montana. And I tried to convince this young man that maybe this should be a project that he should work on and to get back to me because we could really use a project like that. And I think we still can because I haven't seen anything. And if it's out there, please let me know. So why did he call me up? Sitting in Maryland. And the reason he called me up is because I started this organization, the Old Growth Forest Network, where looking at a national level of our old growth forests, because there are wonderful organizations like the Sierra Club that are speaking out for old growth forests and clean air and clean water and energy efficiency, but I could find no forest on the no organization on the national level just simply focused on the forest. So I started thinking, well, we need to save the old growth forests, but more than that, we need to just also bring some forests back, some of those second growth forests that have been cut once to let them recover. And if we could do this in each county of the US where forests can grow, then no one's going to be too far from one of these places where there's a protected forest that's open to the public and relatively accessible. So on this graph here that, I had that thought, and then I thought, well, I should Google the counties, and it was like, wow, there's a lot of them. About 2/3 of them can support forest growth. So the colors on this are different forest types, and where it's white, those are the counties that cannot support forests. So the Old Growth Forest Network, we've been doing our job, and we have many forests, close to 250 by now, but we look at Montana and there's no forest in the Old Growth Forest Network yet. And why is that? That's what we're going to talk about tonight and how we can change that. This, how many of you have seen this graphic before? Okay, this is in my book, Among the Ancients, and it was made in 1925 by the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. And you can see in the upper left, area of virgin forest in 1620. So this is the estimate of where the original forest cover was in our nation. Now, there were indigenous peoples living on the land then, and they were definitely using the forest and clearing some areas of forest, but the forest was not a commodity for them. They were not shipping it off and selling it. And this term virgin forest is kind of, we don't use it anymore. Now we use, excuse me, I think I'm just going to hold this like this. Now we use old growth forest or primary forest or ancient forests. These are all the terms we're going to talk about. So the middle graph, 1850, the middle image, this is after European settlement, and you can see how the old growth forest is disappearing, especially near the waterways, because it was easiest to ship off then. And by now, the forests are a commodity and they're being shipped to other places where they've already cut their forest, like back to Europe. And they're also being used for all the things in this new land, all the trains that are going in and all the ships and all that, the houses and you name it, everything. And by 1920, our original forest was much sparser. And the last image there where it says today, that was really rough, like a rough idea of what was left, each dot representing 25,000 acres. So there might be some little forests there that weren't big enough even to warrant a dot. But the point here is that we really didn't know exactly where the old growth forest was that was left. But we estimated that there was only 1% left in the east and 5% left in the west. And this is an image from the Bitterroot Valley of some of the old growth forests being taken out. Now, excuse me, I think this is better because of my earrings. So this is an interesting moment in time because we're going from where's the old growth? We don't know, we're estimating it here and there, to Earth Day, 2 years ago exactly, President Biden came out with his executive order 14702 saying he wanted the Forest Service and the BLM to tell him a definition of old growth, where it was located, how much of it was there, and this was all in preparation for how can we protect it. So this was the old growth on federal land. He gave them 1 year to come up with the definition, location, and extent. And I thought, wow, that's a big job. But they got to work, and our public servants did give a report of how much there was and a definition. So that was exactly a year ago, Earth Day, that order was fulfilled. And what they told us was that on the Forest Service land, so of the federal land, 81% Forest Service, 19% BLM. And we're looking at that dark bar on the top, it says old growth. So the number they came up with was 18% is what's left on federal land. And this was surprisingly high. And it turns out the reason why it's so high was because 14% of that is the pinyon pine juniper forest. And that's, a lot of that is old growth because it didn't have commercial potential, and so it remained standing. Now, of that 18% old growth, that's divided into the blue line at top says 49%, and then the red line under it 51%. So about half of that is protected, that's the blue, and about half of that old growth forest is not protected. That's the red line going down to no protection designation. So the protected area is the roadless areas, the wilderness areas, and some other minor designations. So the point we need to keep in mind is that half of that federal old growth is not protected, and we need to get that protected. And also there's a lot of mature forest that's not protected. And for the first time, mature forests really came into this conversation. So mature forests would be forests that have been cut once, but now they're in recovery. They're really on their way to becoming old growth. So we're using figures like anything over 80 years old. So that's a whole different topic there. So with those numbers, you know, the next step was going to be, and how do we protect it? But the federal government was saying, oh, the threats to it were insects and fire and diseases. And a lot of us conservationists are going, and cutting it down and cutting it down, you know, don't forget about that. So finally, they put that in there, that logging was a threat to these old forests too. Now, already before this executive order came out, there were national forest logging projects in process that plan to cut old growth forests. So one of them is the Black Ram Project in the Yak Valley up north, and Yak Valley Forest Council is here today, and they've been doing an excellent job speaking out for this forest. And there's a little bit more about it there. That Black Ram Project would include cutting 400 acres of mature and old growth forests, like the one you just looked at there. And so the Yak Valley Forest Council sued the Forest Service because they didn't really consider the effect on the grizzly bears or the climate. And they won in federal court. So the donors to the Yak Valley Forest Council, the people working on that, Rick Bass, who writes so eloquently for it, excellent job. But now the Forest Service is appealing that decision. So it's kind of crazy, you know, at the top of the administration, we have the recognition that these forests are important, but in a lot of the districts, they're still going along with the logging projects that are already planning to cut old growth. And in other places, in Oregon, they questioned one of these old growth logging projects, and that got taken off the table. People in Tennessee are fighting one of these projects right now. So we need to stay on top of that. Okay, so in December 2023, not that long ago, the Forest Service proposed to amend all 128 national forest plans to end the cutting of identified old growth. It's like, yes, you know, huge celebration here. So these weren't the projects that were already identified. These are all new projects. And this is a proposal by the chief deputy of the Forest Service wants to be told if there's any logging going on in the old growth forest. So it really feels like the head of the Forest Service, the chief, the executive agency wants to stop the cutting of old growth. But as I said, a lot of the project levels, it's still going on. And this is just a proposal and it's not finalized. Oops, I'm gonna do that. And in January then, scientists got together and they said, we need a moratorium. We don't want a proposal for future projects. We want you to stop cutting the old growth right now. And not only that, we want you to stop cutting the mature forests too. And then in February, the Western governors, including the governor of Montana, said, you executive branch, you're going way too far here. You know, you should consider the state's rights and you should have talked to us about this before you did it, and we oppose it. So right now, there's like a knot where, you know, it sounds familiar, right? People are fighting over this. There's people that really are trying to do the right thing in our government and save the old growth. And then there's a lot of politicians that are battling it. So this is the time when we need to step in and make our voices known. This summer, there's going to be another comment period to the Forest Service, and we need to say that we want to stop the cutting of the old growth forests. And on the Sierra Club table, there's more information about that, and you can sign a card to the administration. So that's the big picture. Now, moving on from the politics, is there old growth forest in Montana? Since they were supposed to define it and inventory it, and what did they find out? Well, in order to come up with the data, they used the forest inventory analysis. How many of you have heard of that? The FIA plots. Okay, so every 6,000 acres throughout the country, there's this circular plot that's set up, that's occasionally monitored, maybe every 5 or 10 years. You know, are trees still there? How big are they? And this goes into this federal database. Now, also, there's this new database that's been developed starting in 2018 and really kind of finalized in 2022 called Fireshed data. And these fire sheds are 250,000 acres large. So for the president's executive order, when they were trying to identify where it was and define it, they used the FIA plots and these fire sheds. So here's some fire shed data from Montana. And the darker the color, really the older the forest. And so you can see that there definitely is old growth forest in western Montana. Now I'm going to show you a couple more geeky, mappy slides here, just because we're talking about old growth forests in Montana. And I want you to see where this information is coming from. And this is information that you can research yourself too and look. So the federal government, the Forest Service, they put this tree map explorer, these maps together for the whole country. And we can see Bozeman on this map to the left and the center. I wish I had a pointer there, but no. Anyway, you can find Bozeman there, right? And you can see that the darker, redder colors, like the orangish colors, are the forests and the older forests. The green color would be the younger forests. And zooming in a little bit there, Bozeman in the top center, and you can use different queries for this data set. So I here queried live above ground carbon, and the yellower the color, the more carbon, which means the bigger the trees. So the places where you see that yellow is where we'll find the big old growth forests. Now, at the same time that the federal government was developing those maps, there was another group of researchers led by the Wild Earth Guardian organization. And these are international researchers, and they were using aerial data. And it's kind of like they wanted to come up with their own layer so they could kind of fact check the government's layer. So it's really fascinating to me that before this, we didn't have any idea. We didn't have any data layer for old growth. I know because people had called me up, not just this guy who wanted to know where Montana's was, but and other organizations. And so now all of a sudden we're coming up with these maps. So they came up with something called this forest maturity map. And there's Montana, and you can see that the green would be the older forests there. And you can also zoom in on their maps. And when you zoom in on this area in their maps, so the purple blue would be the biggest, oldest forest. So there's definitely old growth forest in this area. And I don't know why all these maps use different color schemes, but they do. And finally, just two more maps. So the National Aeronautics Space Administration has also gotten into this, and they've been doing this work recently using the international space systems and satellite beams to collect LiDAR data to see where the tallest forests are. And this project's called JEDI, G-E-D-I, and they're coming up with some amazing data. So this is not Montana here. This is Pacific Northwest. And this is the NASA JEDI data. And this graph, the lighter color is the biggest, oldest of the trees overlaid over the fire shed. So you can believe that there's a lot of people sitting in front of computer screens right now and technical engineers that are now putting these maps together. This is brand new. And here we have the JEDI data kind of on a larger scale. Again, the whiter the color, the bigger the trees. And look up in California there, right? You can see where the redwoods and the sequoias are by that. So, and you can also see that that Montana does have big old forests there. All right, enough with those maps. This is just, I wanted to share this because, where are the old growth forests in Montana? Well, there's the ground information, but then there's all this other whole layer that's happening right now in this political battle I wanted you to understand. So back to the ground. What about the ground? Because I know people are thinking, well, I want to find out where I can actually go and see one of these forests. And that's what we try to share with people in the Old Growth Forest Network. We're creating this network where people can actually find out where these forests are and go walk in the forest. And if you click on the forest button on our website there, you can see where each of these 236 forests are, descriptions of the forest, where you can park, how long the trail is. So we need to get some Montana forests in that old growth forest network. And there was also a donate button on that last slide. We're entirely funded by individual donors and small family foundations who believe in this project, who think we need to have this national network of places where people can go to experience old growth forests. And also I want to mention all the other organizations that were out in the lobby tonight that are also supported by donations. So thank you to anyone that's a donor for those organizations for working for them. Okay, so Old Growth Forest Network. Here's Montana. Here's all the counties. Not all the counties have old growth forests, but we know that some of them do. Why aren't they in the network? Well, the reason is because we're a small organization and this is a big project, a big national project. It's not just even a statewide project that would be big enough. It's a national project. So we depend on local people to give us ideas, nominations. Anybody, I had those cards out in the lobby. I have one here. So if you got one, you can grab one. You can write on there on your card. Anybody can nominate a forest. Oh, how about this one over there? And or those of you that are watching online, you can go to our website, oldgrowthforest.net. Anybody can nominate a forest. If you're thinking right now of one that would be good for the network, we're looking for places that are open to the public and relatively accessible. We're looking for places that parents can bring kids and you can bring grandkids, places that are not too difficult to get to. So nominations. And then we also need in each county a county coordinator. And that would be the person that says, okay, I'll help you with this in my county. And we give them all the nominations that come in, and they can also talk to other people in the county. They can talk to Forest Service people, they can talk to park people, and they can also explore on their own. And they look at all those criteria, and then they'll make a suggestion to us, and we'll make sure that forest is protected. And then we will go, once we identify what it is, and we'll have a induction ceremony and put that forest into the Old Growth Forest Network. And then you'll have a Montana forest in the Old Growth Forest Network. So we're hoping to have a number of them soon. So I should, that says Park County, it should say Gallatin County, because when I was coming here, I thought, okay, maybe I'll go visit some forests myself. Maybe we'll have an induction ceremony while I'm there. But it's looking like maybe for Gallatin County, Grotto Falls at Highlight Canyon might be the one. I don't know. Talking with friends of Highlight Canyon, but if you have any other suggestions, let me know. And also in Lincoln County, we're probably going to dedicate the Ross Creek Cedars. So both of those places are closed right now because of snow. So I'm gonna have to come back. When I come back, I'm going to dedicate one here. I'm going to dedicate one there. And if you're on our mailing list, I'll invite you and you'll come to the dedications. We'll all hike through the forest together. And here's the Ross Creek Cedars for inspiration, these old growth forests. So that's the politics, the maps, what we do, how we do, why do we do it? I'm getting chills. We do it because we need people to understand what this earth can create, what it looks like when we leave it alone. And we need to bring the next generation out into these places so they will want to preserve them after us. Because if we preserve them and then we're going to be gone soon, these forests are going to be gone. So we need to keep the momentum going. And also, there's a decline in biodiversity globally, and we need to counteract that because these old growth forests are such important places for biodiversity. And this is what encouraged me to write my most recent book, Nature's Temples, that I had out there, because I kept hearing forests need to be managed to be healthy. I kept reading this and hearing it, and I'm going, really? It seemed like nobody was speaking out against that, but I'm a scientist and I like to go for the data. So I decided I was going to look at the data. You know, that's one of the benefits of being a professor. You have access to all of that, all those online databases. And I decided to look at any scientific study that compared an older unmanaged forest, so old growth forest, to one of the more recently cut industrial forests and look at, does management really make these forests healthier? And besides the word health, we'll see cutting for other reasons too, such as restoration, regeneration, sustainability, resiliency. These words all sound really nice, don't they? Who would argue against that? Sure, of course, we've got to cut that forest for all these reasons. But then when you go out there and you see what the after effects are of that management, it's doesn't look anything like any of those words. And what they're leaving off there is the big dollar sign. That's mostly why these cuts get done. It's kind of an old habit we got into to cut these forests that we haven't broken yet, but it's also for the dollar signs. Need to speak out against this. So just wrapping up what I learned in my research in that book. So at the top, there's older unmanaged forests. On the left, the younger managed forests on the right. By management, I'm really meaning cutting. But let's start with salamanders. Well, no, let's start with the trees themselves. So in the older unmanaged forests, the old growth forests, that's where you're going to find the biggest trees on the planet. I think that's an indicator of a healthy forest. You'll also find the oldest trees on the planet in those unmanaged forests. You will also find more salamanders and more species of salamanders in those old growth forests, in part because the salamanders most of them breathe through their skin. They don't have lungs, and they can only get oxygen through their skin if their skin is moist. So they need the damp, moist forest. And they mostly live most of their lives underground in these macropores, they're called, these spaces where the roots had grown down and where that soil is light. And when you come in there with logging equipment, you compact that soil and you dry that land out, and those salamanders die. Okay, lichens. There were more lichens in the older unmanaged forests, including, and this is the things in my book, these tiny little clesioid lichens, these rare lichens that hardly anybody knows how to identify. But in an old growth forest, this is up in the Northeast, they found up to 21 species of them in a forest. And in a younger managed forest, there might be 3 or 4 species of them. The beetles, you know, how many hundreds of different kinds of species of ground beetles are there? And ground beetles, we think, oh, beetle, but they're very important to the food chain in a forest because they help to decompose the wood. They let the fungi get into the wood, and they're eaten by the reptiles and the amphibians, and those things are eaten by the larger animals and so on. So there's more beetles and different types of beetles in the older forest. Fungi, more types of fungi in the old growth forest. Snails, more snail species, some of them only found in the old growth forest. And that means if you cut that forest, you may never see that species again. And also snails they tend to be, have like micro niches. I just made that up, but they don't have a large distribution. There's so many different types. These are things we don't even think about. Like hardly anybody studies these things. I was finding, like for snails, I could find really only a few studies. The most useful one was done by a master's student in Kentucky. And one of the reasons these studies are so rare is because the old growth forests are rare. It's hard to find places to study. Herbs, this is wildflowers. And in fact, we have never seen a forest fully recover wildflower diversity after cutting. And a lot of the wildflowers depend on ants to distribute their seeds. These woodland wildflowers are distributed by the ants. So when you cut the forest, often you're destroying the ants, and it could take these wildflowers 50 years to recover. Finally, carbon storage, back to the top there, much higher in the older unmanaged forests than in the younger forests. So when you cut one of these forests, you're releasing all the carbon that it held. Well, not all the carbon. Some of it stays in the wood for a time, but a lot of the carbon. And you're definitely stopping the carbon withdrawal that those trees were doing. So I thought this was some interesting data, from a scientific paper. So anytime a tree is made up of about 50% carbon. So anytime that tree is dying and decomposing, it's releasing carbon. So a lot of things can cause release of carbon. Anything that kills trees, really. A windstorm can, fire can, insects can, but most of the carbon released from our forests, 85%, is due to forest harvesting. So if we really want to draw down the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, we need to leave more of these forests standing. And we need to let some of the second growth forests get bigger and hold more carbon. And these trees are trying to do their job. They're actually removing about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide due to anthropogenic causes. But we keep cutting them, and they are not able to continue their job. So the folks that are looking to save the Black Ram Forest in Yak Valley, they're saying, let's make it a climate preserve. And I believe we should be doing that with a lot more of our federal forests instead of cutting them. So wrapping up here, when I first started the Old Growth Forest Network, I thought I was creating this network of forests across the country. And as the work evolved, I realized what we're really doing is creating a network of people who care about forests. So sitting in this room and in the audience watching by computer, there are people that know a lot more about the specifics of what's happening in the Montana forest than I do. But the point is that we need to come together, and we need to stand together for the Old Growth Forest Network. We need to be on a team. We need to tell our federal government that they need to stand with us to protect the old growth forests. Thank you.
Donna. Thank you, Joan. That was really interesting. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions out there. We'll be taking some questions from the audience as well as some from online. Mark, We don't have any online questions yet, so people out watching online, get your questions in on your box. And I'll start with taking some questions from the audience here. If you just raise your hand, I will gladly bring the microphone over to you. You have to hold the microphone pretty close.
Early on, you mentioned that a component of the old growth is the pinyon juniper forests, like in the Great Basin, et cetera. And, you know, right now there's a war going on those forests, and we're being told that we're having encroachment by those trees. Could you talk at all about that?
Yeah, so that disturbs me when I hear that they're wanting to remove these trees. They say they're encroaching. Trees have always moved across the land. They've always migrated, although very slowly. And so these trees, as much as I know, I believe that they are kind of migrating across the land in response to changes in our climate. And I think we need to give them space to do that.
Back on. No, none here. So we'll take more questions from our audience in person here. I guess I'll work my way up here.
Hi, John. Do you have some guidelines when we go to a forest? What do we look for? What are the guidelines for an old growth? We want to nominate one.
So different forest types will look a little bit different. If they're old growth, you know, one of the indicators is size sometimes, but not always, you know, and you can have young trees in a forest but there should be occasionally big older trees. I'll also look at the bark pattern. As trees get older, their bark changes. And when you know what kind of changes to expect with different tree species, then you can kind of get an idea of that, like the ponderosa pines, you know, how deeply etched those bark plates get as it gets older. I also tend to look up at the canopy of the tree. Some trees will have fewer limbs up top, but those limbs are a lot thicker. I look for dead, coarse, woody debris. It's actually a good sign to see that in the forest because that's very important for the ecology of the forest to have these decomposing trees on the forest floor. And so when we have somebody that's suggesting a forest for the network, we're looking for all those things and not too difficult to get to. You know, is there a place to park? Because you're going to be driving to get there. Is there a trail? Ideally, there would be a trail. Because we're not looking for that remote wilderness 10 miles in. We're looking for something that we can reach and touch.
Thank you. Okay. How about this young man right here?
What kind of trees are we looking for in old growth forest, like birch, oak, pine? And what trees are you going to suppose would be growing in old growth forest here in Montana?
Thank you for that question. Different tree species grow in different habitats depending on how much rainfall and how much sunshine. So in every county, there might be different forest types. And we have a lot of different forest types that can be considered old growth. So we're not looking for one particular species. We're just looking for older of that. Thank you.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you. Well, I like the idea of Grotto Falls. Most of us have been there. Beautiful place with lots of water. I can think of 2 old growth forests near Bozeman I would have nominated had they not been logged off in the past couple of years. Kirk Hill would be one that we tried to stop. Another one up at Brackett Creek in the Bridger Range. They're both very accessible, both been not clear cut, but trees up to 170 years old cut. So I'm just curious, do you have any kind of criteria for the forests that are included in the network about how threatened they are and what the threats might be? Are we looking for ones that are preserved or ones that are threatened, or is there some kind of listing? Thank you.
Yes. So for a forest to be in the old growth forest network, it has to be protected from logging. So once that forest gets nominated and then identified as best, then we do our research, like, is it protected from logging? And it's really interesting because often people assume that a forest is because it's special and people enjoy it, and they'll say, oh yeah, it's protected. And we'll say, okay, show us, you know, black and white. And then they'll go looking and often they can't find that it's protected. And so at that point, I think it's really useful to let people know that the special forests that aren't protected so that we can work to protect them. But then we also, the Old Growth Forest Network, we will try to help get protections in place, and we'll meet with the forest management. And sometimes they want to protect their forest and will have us help them. And it could be through easement, or it could be through, there's many different avenues of protection. And then the forest can be in the Old Growth Forest Network. So that's some of our most exciting work, when we can get a forest protected that wasn't protected already, to get it into the network. It's like the carrot. So I'm sorry to hear about those other forests that have gone down. I know it's heartbreaking. I still carry a couple forests in my heart that, you know, I think, oh, if only I could have done more. So we also help to advise people that are struggling to save a forest in their community. And we will also write letters of support. And we've created a lot of documents that they can use to help them. So that's on our website under resources.
Okay, we have some online questions. Mark?
Yeah, so you talked about the benefit of trees to help with climate change, but turning it around the other way, what are the major threats of climate change to forests and trees?
Mhm. So I think we can all agree that the climate's changing. And this is creating a climate weirding scenario where we have different storms than we had in the past. And one of the threats from that is that we have higher wind storms than we ever had. And we have some droughts in some places, and then we have floods in other places. I mean, this is a change too. So both of those are threats to forests, both the flooding, which can kill trees and wash them down, and the droughts. But the windstorms during a fire, that's one of the most damaging things, because those windstorms are carrying those embers. So it's strange because the trees could help us slow down that change if we let them, but instead we're cutting them, and then the change causes even more damage to the forest. So it's kind of a do loop. It's feeding on itself.
Another question, so your maps are focused on the US. The question is, how does the percent loss of old growth forests in the US compare with that in Canada? And are you aware of efforts similar to the old growth forest network in Canada?
Yeah, so I specifically had to narrow my focus to the US, right? But I do follow what's happening in other places, and there's big battles happening in Canada too, especially, like, I've seen the old growth forests on Vancouver Island. They're huge and beautiful, and in the Vancouver and British Columbia, and old growth is still being cut there. Beautiful, big old growth, you know, trees 1,000 years old. Like, some of you might have heard of the Fairy Creek incidents where the protesters were trying to protect those trees, and then they were jailed. And So we haven't really gotten involved in what's happening in Canada with the Old Growth Forest Network, but we just do stay aware, and we support the protection of those forests.
Another question about sort of efforts to protect old growth forests. Is the main focus trying to convince politicians to do things differently, or are there other things that you would emphasize that people can do?
Well, we'll start with the people. I'd say one of the best things to do is look around in your community, look around in your area. Where are the oldest forests left? Ask if they're protected. If they're not, try to figure out how to get them protected. If they're privately owned, maybe talk to the owner, or maybe get a land trust to preserve them. And to the first part of the question about the politicians, and I'm just going to wrap this up here then. It's really frustrating to me as an ecologist to see all these organisms that depend on this forest ecosystem. 80% of the terrestrial organisms depend on forest ecosystems. So these trees are just growing up out of our planet if you let them, if you leave it alone. And when they grow up out of the planet, it's like a miracle, they create this habitat for all these other creatures. And they're beautiful and they're spiritual. But the decisions about whether they remain standing or not so often end up in the hands of politicians who really don't understand the ecology and who haven't spent any time in these places. So either we need to educate the politicians or we need to get these decisions out of the hands of the politicians. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Hold on, I have a few closing comments here. Just have to get my notes, but thank you, Joan, so much. I wanted to say that this talk was recorded and it will be available very shortly on our Gallatin Valley Earth Day YouTube channel. So if you'd like to review what you heard tonight, you can go there. I wanted to thank you all for coming this evening. And if you want to find out about future events, we have another event a week from tomorrow right here at the Museum of the Rockies about wildfires with George Werthner. We are partnering with the documentary series. So next Thursday at the Emerson is a great film about grizzly bears, 399. How many of you here in the audience know who 399 is? Okay, almost everyone, yep. So it's called 399 Queen of the Tetons, and it's Thursday, April 18th at the Emerson Center. There'll be a reception with more free food again at 5:45. There'll be a silent auction, and then the film is at 7 p.m. And there it is. So check that out. And then, as I mentioned, a week from Friday is George Werthner talking about wildfire, a century of failed forest policy. That will also be live streamed. So if you can't make it in person, you can sign up for the live stream and get the recording. And help support clean water in our community by participating in the Gallatin Valley Fun Run. It's Saturday, April 20th at 9 a.m. at the fairgrounds. You can register ahead of time by going to the winddrinkers.org website. You can also register same day at 8 a.m. for that, and that is benefiting the Gallatin Watershed Council. And then also join us for our big Earth Day Festival, Saturday, April 20th. At the fairgrounds, 10 to 3. There is something for everyone there. If you have grandkids or kids, we have lots of fun kids activities. The Magic Monster Show is at 10 and 10:30. We have face painting, we have a petting zoo, and lots of kids activities with prizes. There are talks every hour out in the lobby here or online at Gallatin Valley Earth Day. You can check out more details about the talks. There'll be live raptors, music, food, a true festival. So please join us there. So Anyway, that's pretty much it. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you at our next events.